The morning the sky learned how to eat, all life in Dry Fork Bend ground to a sudden halt. Men stood frozen. Women bolted from their kitchens. Even the horses reared in panic. From the western horizon, a massive brown stain came churning forward. At first, it looked like smoke, then like dust. But seconds later, the chilling truth revealed itself. The cloud had wings, millions of wings. The swarm rolled forward like a living storm, spreading wider than any field in sight, and blotting out the sun. The sound arrived next, a dry, rushing hiss that seemed to come from everywhere at once. As the panicked crowd scattered, a wagon rattled straight toward the danger. Hannah Vale climbed down before the wheels stopped turning. Beside her, Brindle hit the ground at a sprint. The dog raced ahead as Hannah threw open the wooden latches of a row of strange rolling pens. Doors swung wide. 200 chickens poured out like water from a broken dam. Feathers flashed. Sharp beaks snapped. Deaf to the terrified screams around her, Hannah calmly watched the cloud descending to strip the land bare. Then, she issued a single command: go. 10 weeks earlier, in the spring of 1874, the road leading into Dry Fork Bend carried more dust than traffic. Hannah Vale followed it home behind a borrowed wagon after the funeral of Gideon Vale, the grandfather who had raised her. By evening, the visitors were gone. The preacher had returned to town. Hoofprints faded from the yard one by one until silence settled over the property. What remained was 30 acres of tired prairie, a weathered farmhouse that leaned slightly toward the north wind, a gray mule named Mercy, a brown dog named Brindle, and a debt large enough to keep most people awake at night. The paperwork waited on the kitchen table beside the only possession Hannah truly wanted to keep. It was an old farming journal with cracked leather covers and pages stained by decades of use. She had barely finished unhitching Mercy when Wade Carver arrived. The grain dealer climbed from his buggy, surveyed the property, and named a price for the land before offering a single word of sympathy. The number was low enough to suggest he had expected this conversation long before the funeral. Hannah listened. Then she declined. Wade glanced toward the fields, wished her luck in a voice that sounded more like a prediction than encouragement, and drove away. Darkness settled over the prairie soon afterward. A kerosene lamp cast a small circle of light across the kitchen, while the old house shifted and creaked around her. Most of the journal contained planting dates, rainfall records, feed calculations, and notes about stubborn seasons. Near the middle, one sentence had been marked twice in faded pencil. A pest becomes a plague, only when nothing waits to eat it. Outside, wind moved through the grass. Inside, Hannah read the line again. Then once more. The debt worried Hannah. Any honest person would have worried about it. Yet the numbers filling Gideon's journal pointed toward a different problem. Rain had been scarce for months. The soil across much of the property looked tired. More troubling still, insects were appearing faster than the crops could recover. Each evening she carried a pencil into the garden. Row 3, 40, 1 beetles. Row 5, 22 cutworms. North cabbage patch, 30% leaf loss. A week later, the figures were worse. Brindle often followed behind her while she crouched beside the rows, counting damage one leaf at a time. The dog did not understand the marks filling the notebook. Hannah did. The bank expected payment in autumn. The insects were collecting theirs every day. By the end of the second week, several pages were crowded with measurements, dates, and rough sketches of damaged plants. The pattern became impossible to ignore. The mortgage might take the farm eventually. The bugs were taking it right now. 3 days later, Hannah rode Mercy into town for feed and supplies. Jonah Bell, the owner of the feed store, was standing beside a wall of wooden crates that seemed to vibrate with noise. Peeping. Scratching. Rustling. The shipment had arrived by mistake. 200 baby chicks. Far too many. Far too late in the season. Nobody wanted them. Can't send them back, Jonah said, and nobody with good sense wants this kind of trouble. He offered the entire lot for $11.40. The price made Hannah pause. It represented nearly everything she had left. Jonah folded his arms. Raised right, most might live. Raised wrong, half won't see summer. Hannah stepped closer to the crates, tiny heads pushed against one another. Tiny feet scratched across pine shavings. Most people would have seen 200 fragile chickens. She saw something different. 200 beaks, 200 small appetites to eat the very things destroying her garden. The arithmetic suddenly looked different. A moment later, she reached for her savings pouch. The trip home took most of the afternoon. By dusk, the small farmhouse sounded alive. Crates lined the kitchen walls. More sat near the stove. Others occupied corners that had not held anything larger than a sack of flour in years. 200 chicks peeped without pause, filling the house with restless noise. Hannah worked until her shoulders ached. She spread fresh straw, set shallow water trays, built barriers to hold warmth close to the chickens. Before turning in, she stood beside the crates and felt satisfied. The room was warm, the chicks were quiet, everything seemed under control. Brindle stretched out on the floor between the rows of crates and refused to leave his post. The confidence lasted until sunrise. 12 chicks lay motionless in the straw. At first, Hannah blamed the cold. A closer look told a different story. The air inside the brooder boxes felt heavy. Moisture clung to the wood. Several surviving chicks were panting. She had sealed the heat in too well. Warmth had stayed. Fresh air had not. For a long moment she stood staring at the losses. Then she carried the small bodies outside, returned to the kitchen, and opened Gideon's journal. An hour later, sketches filled the margins of a blank page. New vents, lower walls, better airflow. The lesson cost 12 lives. She intended to pay for it only once. The following afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Elspeth Crow, a widowed poultry keeper who had outlived most of her generation, stepped onto the porch carrying a basket covered with a cloth. The old woman stopped inside the doorway. Her eyes moved across the crates, then across the kitchen, then back to Hannah. "You've lost your senses," she said. The statement hung in the room for a moment. Elspeth set the basket on the table. Fresh bread filled the air. After that, she rolled up her sleeves. The conversation changed completely. Within minutes, she was checking water trays, lifting chicks, and asking questions Hannah had not thought to ask. How often were the bricks rotated? How dry was the bedding? Which chickens were eating less than the others? She mixed a small vinegar solution for the water, demonstrated how to judge a chick's condition by the brightness of its eyes, explained why damp straw caused more trouble than cold nights. Most importantly, she showed Hannah how to balance heat and airflow, instead of choosing one over the other. The afternoon passed quickly. By sunset, the kitchen looked much the same. The difference was invisible. The system worked better. As Elspeth prepared to leave, Hannah noticed the old woman quietly checking a brooder one final time before reaching for her coat. A second pair of hands had entered the fight. Out on the prairie, the wind continued blowing. Inside the farmhouse, the odds had improved. The days settled into a demanding rhythm. Every 2 hours, Hannah rose from her pallet beside the stove. She checked the brooders, refilled water trays, added feed, removed damp straw. Then she wrote everything down. The journal began collecting numbers almost as quickly as the chicks grew. After the first difficult week, 188 remained. A few days later, the count slipped to 185. Then the losses slowed. The new ventilation worked. Fresh bedding stayed dry longer. Elspeth's vinegar mixture helped prevent the stomach troubles that often swept through young flocks. Progress came in small pieces. A brighter chicken, a fuller feeder, a quieter night. Brindle spent most evenings stretched across the kitchen floor, lifting his head whenever a crate rattled too much. By the third week, feathers had begun replacing down. The surviving chicks looked stronger every morning. One evening, Hannah finished her count, closed the journal, and sat quietly beside the stove. For the first time since spending her savings, she allowed herself to consider a possibility she had avoided. The flock might actually reach summer. Dry Fork Bend discovered the story long before the flock reached maturity. People talked. People always did. At the feed store, at church, and beside wagon beds loaded with seed, The same story traveled from one conversation to the next. The girl with the debt had spent nearly everything on chickens. Someone eventually gave her a nickname, Chicken Hannah. The name spread quickly. Wade Carver seemed particularly fond of it. Each time he passed the property, he found a reason to mention his offer for the land. The price never improved, neither did his opinion. Hannah rarely responded. Arguments would not strengthen a flock. They would not remove beetles from cabbage leaves. They would not reduce a debt, so while the town laughed, she continued filling page after page with measurements, survival counts, feed costs, and observations. The notebook grew thicker. The comments grew louder. Only one of those things was helping her farm. The flock reached the garden shortly after the weather warmed. Hannah had imagined the chickens spreading across the rows and solving her insect problem almost immediately. Reality chose a different approach. The first attempt lasted less than an hour. The young chickens scattered in every direction. Some chased beetles. Others scratched through freshly planted beds. Several discovered tender bean shoots and treated them as an unexpected feast. By afternoon, the garden looked worse than it had that morning. Brindle spent most of the day circling the property, trying to gather chickens that had no interest in being gathered. That evening, Hannah opened Gideon's journal and searched for answers. One entry caught her attention. It described using livestock in small sections rather than allowing them access to an entire field at once. The principle was simple. Control the area. Control the outcome. The next morning she began building. Prototype number 1 emerged from scrap lumber stacked behind the barn. It was a large rectangular frame covered with wire mesh and left open on the bottom. The idea worked. The execution did not. The structure was so heavy that moving it required more effort than the garden itself. After dragging it across 2 rows, Hannah abandoned the design. The second version took shape over the following days. She shortened the frame, removed unnecessary braces, added a pair of small wooden wheels salvaged from an old handcart. A simple pulling handle completed the redesign. This time one person could move it. That changed everything. The first bottomless coop rolled into the cabbage patch on a clear morning. A dozen chickens entered. The wire kept them contained. The open floor kept them working. They scratched, hunted, pecked, consumed every beetle and worm they could find. When the section was finished, Hannah pulled the coop forward several feet and let them start again. The process repeated across the day. By sunset, an entire row had been cleaned without damage to the surrounding plants. Brindle watched from the shade while Hannah studied the results. The coop was not complicated. A few boards, some wire, 2 wheels. Yet the more she observed it, the more possibilities appeared. The chickens no longer needed to wander in search of insects. The insects could be brought directly to the chickens. For the first time, the garden felt less like a battlefield and more like a problem that could be solved. Several additional coops appeared over the next week. Each one rolled a little easier than the last. Each one taught her something new. Once the coops were finished, Hannah put them to work. Every morning began the same way. She checked the flock, reviewed the previous day's notes, then rolled the coops onto a fresh section of garden. The chickens needed very little encouragement. Beetles disappeared first. Cutworms followed. Young grasshoppers rarely lasted more than a few seconds after being discovered. What surprised Hannah was how quickly the numbers changed. Row 4 had become her test section. The first count recorded 52 beetles. 7 days later, she counted only 7. The pattern repeated elsewhere. Damage slowed. New leaves remained intact longer. Plants that had struggled for weeks finally began gaining ground. The soil changed as well. Chicken droppings mixed with loose earth. Scratching chickens broke apart the surface crust left by the dry weather. Water soaked in more easily after rain. Each evening brought another set of measurements. Each page looked a little better than the one before. Brindle had found his own place within the system. The dog moved quietly along the outside edges of the garden whenever a coop was being relocated. Any chicken tempted to wander quickly reconsidered after meeting his watchful stare. By midsummer, The operation followed a reliable rhythm. Move the coop. Let the chickens work. Record the results. Move again. For weeks, Hannah had been defending an idea. Now the garden was beginning to defend it for her. The proof stood in the rows themselves. Healthier plants, fewer insects, stronger soil, and a flock that earned its keep every single day. By late summer, another change began appearing in Hannah's records. The pullets started laying. At first, she collected only 3 or 4 eggs each day. A week later, the basket held 9. Soon, it held a dozen. Then more. Every trip into Dry Fork Bend ended with a few coins returning home in her pocket. The amounts were modest, but Hannah tracked them with the same discipline she applied to everything else. Eggs sold, feed purchased, maintenance costs, surviving chickens. Nothing escaped the ledger. For the first time since Gideon's death, the debt was no longer gaining ground quite so quickly. The garden was helping. The flock was helping. Even the soil seemed to be responding. After several summer rains, Hannah noticed that rows worked by the chickens recovered faster than untouched sections. Water soaked deeper, plants greened sooner. New insect damage appeared more slowly. The system was doing more than controlling pests. It was improving the farm itself. Wade Carver noticed the changes too. His visits became less frequent. The jokes became shorter. A man can laugh easily at a failure. Success creates a different kind of discomfort. One warm afternoon, a rider slowed beside Hannah's fence. Caleb Rusk, a small farmer working 36 acres north of town, rested his arms on the top rail and watched the chickens move through a potato row. Several minutes passed before he spoke. Unlike most visitors, he never smiled. He never mocked. Instead, he asked questions. How much ground could one coop cover in a day? How many insects could a flock remove in a week? How often did the chickens need to be moved? Hannah answered each one by opening her ledger. Numbers replaced opinions. Dates replaced guesses. Caleb studied the pages almost as carefully as the garden itself. When he finally mounted his horse again, he looked back at the moving coops one last time. The expression on his face was thoughtful. For the first time since buying the chicks, someone else had seen more than chickens. Someone had seen a system. Harvest season arrived, and most of Dry Fork Bend focused on the usual concerns: wheat yields, market prices, weather forecasts. The town had little interest in anything beyond the coming harvest. Hannah noticed something else. Grasshoppers seemed to be everywhere. More appeared along fence lines, more gathered in roadside ditches. Entire patches of prairie grass showed fresh damage within days instead of weeks. At first, the changes felt small. One evening she counted insects along a stretch of pasture she had inspected only 4 days earlier. The increase was difficult to explain. The following morning she checked again. The numbers climbed. That night Gideon's journal came down from the shelf once more. Several entries described difficult summers decades earlier. Most dealt with drought, hail, or early frost. A few mentioned grasshoppers. One page received more attention than the others. The handwriting had grown darker there, as though the memory itself carried extra weight. The insects arrived before people understood what they were seeing. They multiplied where no one was counting. By the time they noticed, counting no longer mattered. Hannah read the passage twice. The next afternoon, Elspeth arrived carrying a sack of feed and found the journal open on the table. The old woman studied the page for a moment. Then she nodded slowly. "I remember a year when the sky changed color," she said. That sentence earned little attention from most people in town. Stories from old-timers usually did. Hannah always listened. Afterward, new categories appeared in her ledger: wind direction, daily temperatures, grasshopper density, rainfall. The notebook expanded beyond the garden. Something was changing across the prairie. The signs remained scattered and incomplete. Yet nature rarely announced its intentions all at once. More often, it left clues for anyone patient enough to notice them. Hannah kept writing them down. A week later, the warning arrived. Not from a government office, Not from a telegraph wire. It appeared on the western horizon shortly after sunrise. Caleb Rusk was repairing a section of fence when he noticed it. At first, the shape looked like distant dust rising from the prairie. That explanation lasted only a few minutes. Dust did not hold together that way. Dust did not move with such strange purpose. The brown smear widened as it traveled east. Caleb climbed onto the top rail for a better view. The farther he looked, the less comfortable he became. He saddled his horse immediately. By the time he reached Dry Fork Bend, several others had already gathered in the main street. People pointed west. Conversations stopped. Older residents stared longer than everyone else. A few faces lost color. Hannah arrived, carrying her ledger under one arm. Elspeth stepped out from the feed store and looked toward the horizon. The old woman needed only a few seconds. Her expression hardened. Locusts. The word spread through the crowd faster than the wind. Some dismissed it. Others laughed nervously. Wade Carver belonged to the first group. He folded his arms and watched the distant stain across the sky. Looks like dust to me. Several people nodded. For a moment, the town seemed eager to believe him. Then the cloud grew and kept growing. What had appeared no larger than a storm front now stretched across miles of horizon. The sunlight changed first. The color of the prairie changed next. Even the air felt different. Nobody laughed after that. Wade stopped talking altogether. The brown mass continued advancing from the west, silent at this distance, immense beyond measurement. Weeks of scattered clues suddenly fit together. The extra grasshoppers, the damaged pasture, the notes in Gideon's journal. The stories Elspeth remembered. Nature had been speaking the entire time. Now it stood at the edge of town, waiting for nobody's permission. The swarm arrived just after dawn. By mid-morning, it had chosen its first target, not Hannah's garden, not Caleb's fields. It descended upon Wade Carver's wheat. The largest planting in Dry Fork Bend vanished beneath a moving layer of wings. Men ran into the fields carrying anything they believed might help. Smoke pots appeared first. Dark columns rose into the air. For a few moments, the insects shifted. Then they settled again. Others dragged burlap sacks through the crop, beating at the swarm with desperate energy. Several teams stretched ropes between horses and raced across the wheat, hoping noise and motion might drive the insects away. The effort produced dust, very little else. By late morning, shouting echoed across the fields. Workers sprinted from one section to another as fresh waves dropped from the sky. Every new tactic lasted only minutes before the insects ignored it. The sound never stopped. Millions of jaws worked without rest. Millions of wings lifted and settled. Millions more followed. From a distance, the wheat seemed to dissolve. Green disappeared first, then gold. By noon, entire sections of the field stood stripped to pale stalks. The transformation felt impossible until it happened directly in front of them. Wade moved through the devastation with dust covering his boots and anger written across his face. For years he had trusted acreage, equipment, hired labor, and experience. None of them mattered to the swarm. Hannah watched from a ridge overlooking the valley. There was no satisfaction in the scene. No vindication. No revenge. Only a growing realization. If nature could erase the strongest operation in the county before lunch, every smaller farm stood in even greater danger. The cloud continued moving east. Behind it remained thousands of acres of damaged ground and rows of bare stalks trembling in the wind. The prairie had delivered its verdict, and the day was only half over. Hannah did not waste time studying the destruction. The answer was already sitting in her yard. Within minutes, she was loading the rolling coops onto a wagon. Feed sacks followed. Water barrels came next. Every usable chicken went with them. Brindle leaped onto the wagon before she could call him. Mercy pulled the load hard across the prairie. The destination was Caleb Rusk's farm. The swarm had not fully reached it yet. That mattered. Timing mattered more than speed. When Hannah arrived, grasshoppers already covered sections of the outer fields. Leaves trembled beneath their weight. Small patches of damage appeared everywhere. Caleb met her beside the road. He looked from the coops to the insects, then back again. "What are you doing?" Hannah jumped down and began unloading, putting them where the food is. The first coop rolled into position. The latch opened. A dozen chickens spilled onto the ground, then another dozen, then another. What happened next seemed almost absurd. The chickens attacked immediately. Grasshoppers jumped. Chickens chased. Wings flashed. Beaks snapped. The sound of pecking spread through the field. Within minutes, visible gaps appeared in the infestation. The coop moved forward. The flock followed. Another section cleared. Then another. Caleb stood motionless, watching the process unfold. Nearby, Nora Rusk emerged from the farmhouse carrying her youngest child. She stopped halfway across the yard. Neither of them spoke. They simply watched. The insects kept coming. The chickens kept eating. Hannah pulled the coops forward again. Brindle worked the edges, preventing chickens from drifting away from the target area. Every movement had a purpose. Every adjustment kept the flock focused on the problem directly in front of them. An hour later, the difference was impossible to miss. Rows that had been crawling with grasshoppers now showed only scattered survivors. Leaves remained attached. Plants remained standing. For the first time since the swarm appeared, a section of farmland was actually holding its ground. Caleb knelt beside one of the rows and stared at the evidence. The insects had not left on their own. They had been removed, one beak at a time. Hannah said nothing. She simply moved the coop forward once more. The system that had been mocked for months was finally facing a test large enough for others to see, and for the first time, it was winning. The victory at Caleb's farm came with a limitation that Hannah recognized almost immediately. 200 chickens could protect a field. They could not protect a valley. She stood beside the coops, watching fresh waves of locusts drift across the distant horizon, and reached a conclusion that changed the direction of the entire crisis. The answer was bigger than her flock. Much bigger. Caleb found her studying the sky. "What's next?" Hannah looked toward town. Every chicken in Dry Fork Bend. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Caleb understood. He swung into the saddle and rode hard for town. The trip became a race against the swarm. By the time he reached Main Street, the news from Wade's fields had already spread. People no longer needed convincing that the danger was real. They had seen it with their own eyes. Convincing them of Hannah's solution proved harder. At first, the response was exactly what one might expect. Chickens against locusts? Several farmers shook their heads. Others dismissed the idea outright. Years of habit do not disappear in a single afternoon. Then Caleb pointed toward his surviving field. The contrast was impossible to ignore. One section remained largely intact. The neighboring ground looked as though fire had swept through it. "I watched it happen," he told them. "Those chickens are the reason that crop is still standing." The statement carried weight because it came from someone with nothing to gain. The first farmer agreed to bring his flock. A second followed. Then a third. Once movement started, momentum took over. Wagons rolled out of barns. Children chased chickens through yards. Families loaded crates, coops, and feed sacks. The town that had laughed at Chicken Hannah suddenly found itself gathering every chicken it could find. By late afternoon, the count passed 1,000, then 1,300, then 1,700. The collection stretched across an entire pasture near Caleb's farm. Chickens of every size and color filled the temporary holding area. The noise was extraordinary. So was the sight. Hannah climbed onto the bed of a wagon where everyone could see her. Months earlier, many of these same people had mocked the rolling coops. Now they waited for instructions. She organized the chickens into working groups, assigned water stations, mapped sections of vulnerable crops, calculated how many coops would be needed in each location. The operation began taking shape with surprising speed. Nobody talked about pride anymore. Nobody talked about old opinions. The swarm had erased those conversations. As the sun lowered toward the western hills, farmers moved through the gathering crowd carrying crates and feed buckets, following directions from the woman they once dismissed. For the first time since the crisis began, hope returned to Dry Fork Bend. It arrived on thousands of small feet. Then the wind changed. It came out of the south in a hot push, hard enough to flatten the grass and lift dust from the wagon tracks. At first, no one understood what it meant. The chickens were working. The coops were moving. Fields that should have been lost were still holding. Then the locusts rose. They lifted all at once, as though the ground itself had rejected them. A dark sheet rolled upward from the wheat and turned in the air. The chickens chased the shadows beneath them, snapping at nothing. The swarm climbed higher, too high. Men stopped pulling coops. Women lowered water pails. Children who had been gathering loose chickens stood still in the grass. 1,700 chickens milled across the field with nothing left to reach. The locusts had gone over them. For the first time that day, Hannah sat down on the wagon step. Her hands were covered with dust. Her sleeves were torn near one cuff. The ledger in her pocket had bent from hours of movement. She looked across the field and said nothing. The swarm wheeled above the valley, thick and restless, then drifted toward the creek bottom. The best remaining wheat in Dry Fork Bend stood there. Green, heavy-headed, almost ready. If the swarm landed there, the town would lose what Wade had already lost. Caleb removed his hat and stared at the sky. Wade Carver stood near the edge of the field, his face empty of its old certainty. Several farmers began turning toward their wagons. Hope, once broken, often looks for a reason to leave quickly. Elspeth Crow did not move. She watched the cloud. Her old eyes followed its turn toward the creek. Then she stepped close to Hannah. "They fly to feed," she said. Hannah looked up. Elspeth pointed toward the bottomland. "That wheat is where they're going." The idea arrived without ceremony, not a speech, not a miracle, a correction. They had been chasing the swarm. They needed to meet it. Hannah stood. "Get to the creek fields," she called. "All of you. Take the chickens ahead of it." The first wagon lurched forward before the words had fully settled. Then another. Then the whole road began to move. Crates slammed shut. Coops were lifted. Horses strained into harness. Brindle ran alongside Hannah's wagon, barking at loose chickens until they turned back toward the loading pens. The race to the creek bottom became something Dry Fork Bend would remember for decades. Wagons thundered over ruts. Dust rose behind wheels. Feathers blew loose in the air. Men who had laughed at Hannah in town now drove teams hard behind her, carrying chickens as if they were carrying seed, corn, water, and winter itself. They reached the creek fields with the swarm still high to the west. Minutes mattered. Hannah climbed onto a wagon bed and pointed across the standing wheat. "Do not scatter them wide. Keep them where the grain is thick. The swarm wants the greenest heads." Farmers moved fast. The rolling coops dropped into lines. Chickens poured from crates. Water stations formed along the edges. Elspeth checked the tired groups and pushed fresh chickens forward. Caleb took the north side. Wade, without being asked, hauled 2 heavy coops into place near the creek bend. Nobody commented on it. There was no time. Brindle ran the outer edge, turning back stray chickens with sharp barks and quick feet. The flock spread beneath the wheat in a living carpet of feathers, beaks, claws, and restless hunger. Above them, the cloud lowered. The sound grew until speech became difficult. A dry hiss filled the bottomland. The sun dimmed. Some farmers flinched. Old instinct told them to run, beat the air, light smoke, and swing sacks at a force too large to notice them. Hannah raised one hand. "Let them land." The command seemed wrong to every frightened body in that field. Still, they held. The locusts came down. They struck the wheat in a brown rush, exactly as they had struck Wade's fields. But this time, the ground was waiting. The chickens surged. The first wave of locusts disappeared almost as soon as it touched the stalks. Chickens snapped them from leaves, caught them in the grass, leaped for them as they dropped from the air. The brown layer never had time to settle into a blanket. Hannah grabbed the handle of a coop and pulled. "Move with it." Caleb took the next frame. Wade took another. Soon the entire line was shifting across the bottomland, keeping the chickens under the heaviest fall. The swarm tried to feed. The flock fed faster. For hours, the battle moved by yards, then by rows, then by whole strips of wheat. Whenever the insects thickened, Hannah redirected the coops. Whenever a group of chickens slowed, Elspeth sent in a rested batch. Brindle held the ragged edges together when noise and movement threatened to scatter the flock. The work was ugly. Dust filled mouths. Sweat ran into eyes. Hands blistered on wood handles. Yet the wheat remained standing. That was the only measure anyone trusted now. By the time the sun touched the horizon, the swarm had changed shape. What had arrived as a single dark body broke into ragged pieces. Thin bands lifted from the field and drifted east, no longer thick enough to darken the sky. The creek wheat stood. Caleb's field stood. Hannah's garden stood. Across the bottomland, chickens sat heavy and silent, too full to move far. The farmers stood among them, looking at the crop that should have been gone. No one cheered at first. The quiet said more. Wade Carver walked to Hannah after the last light had turned the wheat gold. His hat was in his hand. "I was wrong," he said. The words came rough, but they came. Hannah looked past him at the standing field. "There's still work tomorrow." That was all. A year later, nearly every farm around Dry Fork Bend had rolling coops of its own. Families kept schedules for spring and summer pests. Flocks were pooled before outbreaks grew too large. Small farmers who once fought alone now moved chickens by agreement, field by field. Before insects became disaster, Reverend Abel Troe, the town minister who kept the community records, wrote the compact into the church ledger after harvest. The people called it the Veil Line. On a clear morning the following June, Hannah stood at her fence while Penny, the small hen with the gold mark at her neck, led a group of chickens through a fresh vegetable row. Brindle rested in the shade below the rail. The old farming journal lay open in Hannah's hands. Near the final page, Gideon's underlined sentence remained where it had always been. A pest becomes a plague only when nothing waits to eat it. Beneath it, in Hannah's smaller handwriting, a new line had been added. And a small thing, tended long enough, can feed a town.